The morning Simon Ellsworth rode into Calico Creek, Texas, the town did not stop to greet him. It stopped to stare, and not with the kind of stare that comes from admiration. It was the spring of 1878, and Calico Creek sat fat and self-satisfied along the banks of a shallow river that turned muddy every time it rained, which in that part of West Texas was not nearly often enough. The town had a general store, a feed mill, a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall, a church that the reverend kept threatening to paint white, and roughly 300 souls who all believed they knew the measure of a man the moment they laid eyes on him. They looked at Simon Ellsworth and they measured him fast, the way people do when they are certain the math will come out in their favor. He was broad across the shoulders, dark-haired beneath a battered trail hat, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the Texas hills. He sat a roan horse with the easy confidence of a man who had ridden long distances many times. And then they noticed, as they always noticed, that his right sleeve was folded and pinned at the elbow, the arm beneath it simply gone, lost somewhere in a life that had taken more from him than most people in Calico Creek had ever been asked to give. The whispers started before he had even tied his horse at the post. Old Mercer, who ran the feed mill and considered himself the unofficial voice of the town's opinion, leaned against the doorframe of his store and said to no one in particular, "Now what's that man planning to do out here with one arm?" His wife, standing just inside the doorway, said quietly, "Hush, Gerald." But Gerald Mercer was not a man who hushed easily, and so the question hung in the dry spring air like dust. Simon paid none of it any mind, or if he did, he had long since learned to arrange his face so that it showed nothing of the cost. He tied the roan with a practiced one-handed knot that would have impressed a sailor, rolled his shoulder once to settle the weight of the saddlebags, and walked into the general store as though he owned the road he'd come in on. The general store belonged to a man named Abbott, who was fair enough in his dealings and kept decent stock. Simon bought flour, coffee, a coil of rope, 3 boxes of nails, and a survey map of the plots to the north of town that the land office had filed the previous autumn. He paid in coin, counted out with the fingers of his left hand against the counter, and asked Abbott where a man might find work while he got himself established. Abbott scratched the back of his neck. "Established," he repeated, as though the word required examination. "I've got a land claim filed," Simon said, 40 acres north of the creek bend. I mean to build on it." Abbott looked at the folded sleeve. He looked back at Simon's face and found there a steadiness that made him slightly uncomfortable with the thought he just had. "Day labor's not hard to come by at the Haverson Ranch this time of year," he said, deciding to answer the question as asked. 2 miles east on the main road. He's getting ready for branding season." Simon nodded. "Thank you." He was nearly at the door when Abbott called after him, not unkindly, "Son, building a house, that's hard work for 2 men." Simon paused with his hand on the doorframe. "Yes, sir," he said. "It usually is." And he walked out. Louise Dugan had been in Calico Creek for 6 months before Simon arrived, which was long enough to know that the town had opinions about nearly everything, and short enough that she was still finding which of those opinions mattered and which ones could be respectfully ignored. She had come from Missouri at the age of 24, following her father's death and the subsequent discovery that the farm he'd left her was mortgaged past saving. She had a school teacher's certificate, a trunk of books, a stubbornness that her mother had always called a character flaw and her father had quietly called a gift, and not much else. The Calico Creek schoolhouse had needed a teacher, and Louise had needed a place. It was not the most romantic arrangement, but the West was full of such arrangements, and most of them worked out well enough. She was not beautiful in the way that the dime novels described. She was not golden-haired or porcelain-skinned. She had dark red hair that she kept pinned tightly during school hours, and which fell around her shoulders in the evenings, with a kind of relief that always made her feel more like herself. Her eyes were a gray that shifted toward green depending on the light. She was tall for a woman of the time, with hands that were more accustomed to work than to being admired, and a mind that moved too quickly for small talk, which had given her the reputation in certain circles of being difficult. She did not think of herself as difficult. She thought of herself as precise. She was crossing the main street on the afternoon of Simon's arrival, carrying a stack of McGuffey readers that needed mending, when she first saw him. She noticed the missing arm almost at the same moment everyone else did, and she noticed, the moment after, the way the town noticed it, the drawn-up posture of judgment, the whispers passed behind hands, the particular species of pity that Calico Creek seemed to specialize in, which contained within it a comfortable superiority. She watched him walk into Abbott's store, and she thought two things in quick succession. First, that he moved with an ease that suggested he had long since stopped apologizing for what he was, and second, that the town was going to give him a very hard time of it, and he probably knew that too. She went on her way. But she thought about him that evening while she was mending the readers by lamplight, in a way that was more curiosity than anything else, and less pity than most of what the town had to offer. Simon got the work at the Haverson Ranch. Jeb Haverson was a practical man who cared about what a worker could do, not about what he was missing, and after Simon roped a calf one-handed in the time it took most men to set their feet, Haverson stopped thinking about the sleeve entirely and started thinking about where else he could use a man with that kind of rope work. The pay was fair. Simon saved what he could and spent his evenings on his land, pacing it out, measuring, planning. The 40 acres were good land. There was a stand of live oak near the eastern edge that he intended to use for framing timber, and the soil close to the creek bed ran dark and deep. He lay on his back in the grass some evenings and looked up at the sky that went on so long in that part of Texas that it seemed to curve at the edges, and he thought about what it would feel like to have a house on this ground. His own ground. A thing built by his own hands. Well, his own hand. He had lost the arm at Palo Duro Canyon in 1874, not in battle exactly. It had been an accident of a ricochet during a skirmish with a Comanche raiding party that had not gone the way either side intended. He had been 20 years old, scouting for the army, and the surgeon had taken what remained of the arm 3 inches below the elbow because there had been no saving it. He had spent 6 months learning to be himself again, and the 6 months after that learning to be better than he had been before. It was not a story he told often, because people who heard it tended to look at him with an expression he found worse than pity, a kind of reverent sympathy that made him feel like a relic rather than a man. He was 24 now, the same age as Louise Dugan, though he would not know that for some time. The first time they actually spoke was at the Haverson Church social in May, which was the kind of event where the whole town turned out because there was food and because it was expected, and where the social geometry of Calico Creek arranged itself with all the precision of a folk dance. The same people stood with the same people, the same opinions were shared, and any newcomer navigated it like a stranger stepping into a river with an uncertain depth. Louise was there because the schoolteacher was always expected to be present at community events, and because she had made a custard that she was privately proud of and wanted to see properly appreciated. Simon was there because Jeb Haverson had said come, and it seemed rude not to. He was standing slightly apart from the main group of men, not out of shyness. There was nothing shy about Simon Ellsworth, but because the conversation had turned to a recent land dispute that he had no stake in and no opinion worth sharing, and he had found himself drifting toward the edge of the gathering where the air was cleaner and the food table was nearby. Louise was at the food table, carefully arranging slices of the custard onto a serving dish. She looked up when he approached and did the thing that she had trained herself to do, which was to look at his face first, the way she would look at any person, and then greet him as a person rather than as a situation. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, because she had made it a point to learn the names of the town's newcomers, of which there were currently 2, Simon and a Norwegian family named Strand who had come for the farming. He was mildly surprised that she knew his name. "Miss," he said, and then realized he did not know hers. "Louise Dugan," she said. "I teach school. Would you like some custard?" "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She handed him a plate. He took it with his left hand, and she did not make any adjustment or show any particular concern about the logistics of the exchange, which he noticed the same way a man notices the absence of something he has been braced to feel, with a kind of relief so quiet it almost felt like calm. "You filed on the land north of the creek bend," she said, not as a question. "Word travels," he said. "It's a small town," she said. "How are you finding it? The land or the town? Both, I suppose." He considered. "The land is good. The town has a lot of opinions." Louise smiled, and it was a genuine smile with a slight edge to it. "That's the most accurate description of Calico Creek I've heard since I arrived." "When did you arrive?" "October. You came in April. So you're more established than I am." "Only technically," she said. "They still call me the Missouri schoolteacher behind my back, which I suppose is better than some of the other things they call newcomers." He ate the custard, which was very good, and told her so. She thanked him without false modesty. They stood there for a few minutes in the kind of comfortable silence that is actually rare between two people who have just met, the kind that happens when neither person feels the need to fill space with noise. And then the social current of the gathering pulled them apart, her to the women who wanted to discuss the school's upcoming examination, him to Haverson, who had a question about the branding schedule. But Louise thought about the conversation on the walk home. There had been something in it, not the content particularly, but the quality of it, the way he had been entirely present and entirely unperformative. Most men she had talked to since coming west had been performing something: competence, generosity, authority, good humor. Simon Ellsworth had just been there, eating custard and talking. She thought that was rather more interesting than it sounded. Over the weeks that followed, the town's pity for Simon Ellsworth settled into a kind of comfortable background noise, the way pity tends to do when it does not cost the pitier anything. People shook their heads when they saw him working. They made remarks at the saloon about whether he would ever get that land developed. Gerald Mercer told anyone who would listen that it was a crying shame. A young man like that with a claim he could never work properly, and that someone ought to tell him before he wasted any more money on it. No one told him. No one actually talked to him about it, because that would have required them to treat it as a real concern rather than a conversational pleasure. And Calico Creek's pity, like most pity, was more interested in being felt than in being useful. Simon worked at the Haverson Ranch through May and into June. He was saving every dollar with the discipline of a man who had decided exactly what he wanted and was willing to wait for it. He had ordered timber to supplement the live oak he would cut himself. He had drawn and redrawn his plans for the house: 1.5 stories, 4 rooms, a deep porch across the front, a kitchen in the back with a proper chimney. Nothing grand by any standard except the standard of having built it yourself on ground that belonged to you. He had designed the whole thing with one hand in mind. That was the part no one understood, because no one bothered to ask. The design incorporated techniques he had worked out over years of living with one arm. The way the timber would be notched and wedged so that one strong hand could secure the joints without a second set of hands to hold them. The way he would use a timber frame rather than full log construction, which allowed for more precise placement. The way he had practiced, quietly and without audience, over the past 3 years, building a small barn for a rancher in New Mexico, repairing a bridge in Arizona, learning what was possible when you were willing to think longer than the other man. He did not talk about any of this in Calico Creek, partly because he had no one to talk to about it, and partly because he had learned that the announcement of what he intended to do was worth nothing compared to the doing of it. Louise began to see him more regularly after the church social, in the way that two people in a small town inevitably begin to see each other once they have exchanged more than pleasantries. He came to the store on the same days she did her shopping. He attended the Sunday services, which she was required to attend as the schoolteacher. They spoke briefly each time, 2 or 3 minutes of the kind of conversation that is, on its surface, about nothing in particular, and beneath its surface about the slow accumulation of familiarity that precedes everything else. She learned that he had grown up in Tennessee and come west at 17, that he could read and had read a great deal, that he had opinions about land and water rights that were considerably more sophisticated than those of most men in Calico Creek, and that he kept those opinions to himself in situations where sharing them would not have been productive. She found this restraint interesting rather than evasive. It spoke, she thought, to a man who had decided what was worth his energy and what was not, which was a decision she respected because she was still in the process of making it herself. He learned that she had been teaching for 4 years, first in Missouri and now here, that she was serious about the work in a way that went beyond simply needing the income, that she had read more books than most people in the county, and that when she talked about them, her face changed in a way that was different from how she looked when she was being careful or professional. It opened up, became something more unguarded. He noticed this the way he noticed everything, quietly and without making a point of noticing it. He also noticed that she was the only person in Calico Creek who talked to him without her eyes ever going to the folded sleeve. Not in an obvious, deliberate way, as if she was making an effort not to look. It was genuinely that it did not seem to be a feature of their conversations that required management. This was rarer than it should have been, and he knew it, and it settled something in him that he had not been aware was unsettled. In the middle of June, Simon began building the house. He started on a Saturday morning early, when the air was still cool and the light was low and golden over the hills. He set up his tools with the efficiency of a man who knew where everything was before he reached for it, and he began. The first thing anyone in Calico Creek knew about it was that Carter Webb, who drove the supply wagon north on Saturdays, came back on Saturday afternoon and told his wife that the one-armed cowboy was out there on his land working like 3 men. His wife told the widow Ellison, who told Gerald Mercer's wife, who told Gerald, who went out on Sunday afternoon with his hands in his pockets and the expression of a man who intends to be helpful. What Gerald Mercer found was not what he had expected. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, some kind of earnest futility, a man struggling against the obvious math of his situation, making a brave attempt that would ultimately require the intervention of more able-bodied neighbors. He had half planned to offer those neighbors, to organize something, to be the man who had stepped in when it counted. Instead, he found Simon Ellsworth working at a pace that was, there was no other word for it, remarkable. The foundation stones were already placed and leveled. The timber sill plates were laid. The man was working with a combination of tools that Gerald had not seen arranged quite that way before. A series of clamps and wedges that held timber precisely in place, while a single strong hand drove the fastening. He worked fluidly, without pause, without the hesitation that Gerald had assumed would characterize every movement. He moved from one task to the next with the focused momentum of a man who had planned this so many times in his mind that the physical execution was simply catching up with the plan. Gerald stood and watched for 10 minutes. Then he went home and did not say much to his wife, which was unusual for Gerald, and which his wife noted with interest. Louise heard the reports from Carter Webb's wife, who was also the mother of 2 of her students, and therefore someone she saw regularly. "They say he's moving fast out there," Mrs. Webb said, with the slightly uncertain tone of a person whose previous assessment is being revised without their full consent. "I wouldn't have thought it possible." "Why not?" Louise said, more directly than she intended. Mrs. Webb blinked. "Well, I mean the arm. A man can build a house with one arm if he knows what he's doing," Louise said. "I expect Mr. Ellsworth knows what he's doing." She did not know why she was so certain of this. She had perhaps been paying more attention than she had admitted to herself. The following Saturday, she found herself walking north along the creek road in the late morning with no very precise accounting of why she was going in that direction. It was a pleasant day. She had finished her school preparations. The creek road was a reasonable walk. These were all true things. She heard the work before she saw it, the measured sound of a hammer, and the lower sound of timber being settled into place. She came around the bend of the creek where the live oak started and stopped. He had been building for 1 week. In 1 week, the frame of a house had risen from the Texas earth with a solidity and a geometry that made her breath catch just slightly, the way it sometimes did when she encountered something that was more than she had been prepared for. The wall frames were up. The ridge beam was in place. He was working on the rafters, standing on a scaffolding of his own construction, moving with the kind of unhurried precision that is actually faster than urgency because it does not waste motion. She stood at the edge of the property line and watched him for a long moment. She was thinking about what it had cost him. Not the arm, not exactly, but the years of thinking and planning and practicing, and refusing to believe what everyone around him had probably believed, which was that certain things were no longer possible. She was thinking about the particular stubbornness required to design around an impossibility until it ceased to be one. She was thinking that she recognized something in it. He noticed her when he came down from the scaffolding to get a different tool. He did not seem surprised to see her there, which surprised her slightly. "Miss Dugan," he said. "Simon," she said, and then wondered if the use of his first name was too forward, but he did not seem to think so. "You want to see it?" he asked. "If you don't mind." He did not mind. He walked her through it, explained the modifications he had made to the standard timber frame approach, the notching system, the wedge and clamp setup that served in place of a second pair of hands. He explained it simply and without either false modesty or excessive pride, in the way of someone describing a practical solution to a practical problem. She listened the way she listened when something was genuinely interesting to her, which was with her whole attention, asking questions that revealed she had understood the previous answer. "The rafters," she said, looking up at the clean angle of them against the sky. "How do you set them? They require being held at both ends while you drive the peg." He showed her the notch system at the ridge beam, the way each rafter was designed to lock into position before it needed securing, holding itself long enough for him to move from one end to the other. It was elegant. She said so. "Took me 3 years to work it out," he said, and there was something in his voice, not quite vulnerability, but the thing that lives next door to it, which is the sound of a person saying something true that they do not usually say. 3 years, she repeated. "I built other things first. A barn, a grain shed, learned what worked." He paused. "This is the first house." She looked at him then directly, the way she looked at people when she wanted to understand them rather than simply observe them. "Why a house?" she asked. "Why here?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land around them, the live oaks, the creek silver in the distance, the Texas hills rolling away to the south under a sky that had gone very blue in the midday heat. "Because it's mine," he said simply. "Because I built it." She understood that. She understood it in a way that went deeper than sympathy, and into something more like recognition. They stood there in the June heat looking at the rising frame of the house for a while, and neither of them said anything for a bit, but the silence was the good kind, the kind with room in it. "I should let you get back to work," she said. "You could stay," he said. It was not quite an invitation and not quite a question, and he said it with such matter-of-fact casualness that it took her a moment to understand he actually meant it. She stayed. She sat under one of the live oaks with a book she had brought in her bag, and she read while he worked, and every now and then one of them would say something, and the other would respond, and it was the most natural afternoon she had spent in Calico Creek since arriving. When the light began to drop toward the late afternoon angle that meant the working day was ending, she closed her book and told him she would see him on Sunday. He said yes, and watched her walk back down the creek road, and stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary before turning back to secure his tools for the evening. The house went up fast. faster than anyone in Calico Creek had expected or, in certain cases, wished to expect. There is a complicated species of disappointment that comes to people whose pity has been rendered unnecessary, and several residents of Calico Creek were experiencing it in those weeks of June and July as reports of the house's progress came in from people who drove the North Road. Carter Webb came back from one of his supply runs with the news that the walls were up and the roof was on, and that the one-armed cowboy had done it in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Gerald Mercer went out there again himself to verify it, and came back quieter than he had gone. His wife, who was a perceptive woman named Clara and who had said nothing during the months of her husband's pitying commentary, looked at him when he came in that second evening and said, "Gerald, that man doesn't need our sympathy." "No," Gerald said, with the humility of a person who has just been educated at some cost to their previous position. "No, I don't expect he does." Word spread as word does in a small town, but the quality of it had changed. The pity had not exactly disappeared. Pity is a stubborn weed, but something else had started growing alongside it. Respect has a different sound than pity. It is quieter and heavier and tends to stay in a room longer. Louise heard all of it and said less about it than she felt, because she had by this time understood that what she felt about Simon Ellsworth's house was tangled up with what she felt about Simon Ellsworth, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. She had gone back to the property 3 more times in June. Each time she told herself it was a pleasant walk and she enjoyed the oak shade. Each time she sat under the same tree and read, and they talked in the unhurried intervals of his work, and each time the conversation went deeper, into her life in Missouri, the farm she had lost, the particular loneliness of starting over somewhere new, into his years in New Mexico and Arizona, and the slow determined work of becoming useful to himself on his own terms. Into books they had both read and arguments they had about them, the kind of arguments where no one is actually trying to win, and both people are enjoying the friction of different minds against a shared subject. She had started to think that she was falling in love with him in the way that is most inconvenient, which is the slow way, the way that does not announce itself dramatically, but accumulates like water in a basin, quietly and steadily, until one day you notice that the basin is full and has been full for some time. She had not said any of this to him. He had not said anything equivalent to her, but there was a quality to their conversations now that had not been there at the church social, a warmth, a specificity, a sense of two people who are learning not just the facts of each other's lives but the contours of each other's minds, which is a more intimate kind of learning and takes more trust. In the first week of July, he asked her if she would like to see the inside of the house. The interior was not finished. There were no floor planks yet in the upper half-story, and the kitchen hearth was rough-built. But the main room was solid and clean, with light coming in from the south-facing windows he had placed with obvious thought for the angle of the winter sun. She walked through it slowly, and he watched her look at it, and she said nothing for a minute because she was moved in a way that required a moment's collection before it could be expressed sensibly. "It's beautiful," she said, and she meant the craftsmanship, but she also meant something else, which was that the whole thing was an act of defiance made material, a man insisting in timber and nail and clay mortar that he was here and he was capable and this land was his and no amount of other people's doubt could undo any of those facts. "Still some work," he said. "Yes," she said, "but the bones of it are right." They were standing in the main room in the afternoon light, and she had turned to look at the south windows, and he was standing perhaps 4 feet from her, and neither of them was pretending very convincingly that this visit was simply about architecture. "Louise," he said. She turned around. "I think you know I'm not much for circling around things," he said, "so I'm going to say this straight and you can tell me if I've read it wrong." "All right," she said, and her voice was steady, which required some effort. "I think about you," he said. "When I'm working, when I'm not working. I think about the things you say and the way you think and the way you don't look at me like I'm a problem to be managed. I haven't met many people who do that." He paused. "I would like, if you're willing, to call on you properly, as a man does when he intends something serious." The light in the room was soft and warm, and the whole house around them smelled of fresh-cut timber and Texas earth. Louise Dugan looked at Simon Ellsworth and understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes when something you have been slowly thinking is suddenly, definitively thought, that the basin had been full for some time. "I think you've read it right," she said. He smiled then, a full proper smile that transformed his face in a way she had not quite seen before, because he did not give it out easily, and she understood that this was one of the things that made it worth waiting for. He called on her the following Sunday, in the proper fashion, came to her door at the schoolteacher's cottage with his hat in his left hand and the serious intention he had mentioned, and they sat on the small porch and talked for 3 hours while the July evening cooled around them. Mrs. Webb, who lived across the lane, reported to half a dozen people by Monday morning that Simon Ellsworth had called on Miss Dugan, and that she had seemed very pleased about it. The town had opinions, naturally. Calico Creek always had opinions. Some people said it was kind of her to take an interest in the poor man. Some people said she was a schoolteacher and ought to know better. A few people, the ones who had driven the North Road and seen the house going up, and had readjusted their assessments accordingly, said simply that it seemed like a reasonable pairing between two people who appeared to know what they were about. Simon found out about these opinions only in fragments, through the kind of overheard conversations that happen in a town where the walls are thin and the spaces between people are small. He did not find them troubling exactly, but they clarified something he had been half decided on for a while. He was going to finish the house, and then he was going to ask Louise Dugan to marry him, and he was going to do it with enough surety that there would be nothing left for the town to say except to agree that it made sense. Through July he called on her every Sunday and sometimes on Wednesday evenings, when the school preparation was done and the air was cool enough to walk. They walked along the creek road in the evenings and talked, and he told her things he had not told very many people about the day at Palo Duro, not with drama, but with the quiet honesty of a person who has made peace with a hard thing and can describe it plainly. She listened without filling the pauses, which was the right thing to do, and afterward she told him about her father's farm and the foreclosure and the grief of watching something you loved be taken apart by forces too large for any amount of love to hold back. They were both people who had lost things and learned to build something else from what was left, and in this they understood each other at a level that needed no translation. He kissed her for the first time on the last Wednesday evening of July, on the creek road where it curved beneath the big cottonwood tree that leaned out over the water. It was not dramatic. There was no thunder, no sweeping music. It was simply two people who had been circling the same gravity for weeks and had finally arrived at the center of it, and it was soft and certain and tasted like the coffee they had drunk earlier at her porch. And when they stepped back from each other, both of them were smiling in the slightly dazed way of people for whom something has just become permanently true. "Well," Louise said. "Yes," Simon said, which was, she thought, exactly the right response. In the second week of August, the house was done. Not the way a house is sometimes called done when it is merely livable. It was done in the full sense, with the floor planks fitted and smoothed, the kitchen hearth built properly and tested, the windows hung with wooden shutters that could be adjusted for sun and wind, the porch across the front deep and level with 2 wooden chairs that he had made himself during the slower evenings of July. The upper half-story had a sleeping room with a real bedstead frame and a window that looked north toward the hills. He had built it in 11 weeks, 1 man, 1 arm. When Carter Webb drove the North Road that second week of August and pulled his wagon to a stop in front of it, he sat there for a long moment with the reins slack in his hands and just looked at it. The house stood on its ground the way buildings stand when they have been built right, not imposing, not pretending to be more than it was, but utterly confident in its own existence. The porch faced the morning sun. The chimney was straight and strong. The walls were plumb. Carter Webb drove back to town that afternoon and walked into the saloon and said, with the quiet conviction of a man reporting something he has personally witnessed and is still processing, he finished it. The whole house, 11 weeks. The saloon was quiet for a moment. The whole thing, said Dobbs, who repaired harnesses and had spent the previous 2 months quietly agreeing with Gerald Mercer's assessments. The whole thing, Carter said, porch and all. Gerald Mercer was in the saloon that evening. He drank his glass of beer without saying anything for a while, and then he said to no one in particular, "I suppose we owe that man an apology." No one in the saloon disagreed with this, which was itself something. Simon came to Louise's door on the Sunday following, and when she opened it, he asked her to walk with him. She could tell from the quality of his stillness, which was different from his usual calm, denser somehow, that something had changed, and so she got her hat and walked with him. He took her up the creek road in the early morning light, when the air still had the faint coolness of the night in it, and the creek caught the sun in long silver flashes through the trees. She knew where they were going. She had known for a few weeks, in the way that you know things when you are paying close enough attention to someone. He stopped in front of the house and let her look at it from the road. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything. The morning light was on it just right, and the porch shadows were blue and deep, and the whole thing had the completeness of something that has fulfilled its intention. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said, "and I want to ask you something about it." She turned to look at him. His face had that openness to it that she had seen only a few times, the same quality it had when he had told her about Paulo Duro, and when he had kissed her under the cottonwood tree. The removal of something he usually kept up. "Louise," he said, "this house has a room that's meant to be a schoolroom if you want it, and a kitchen designed for someone who knows what they're doing in one, and a porch for evenings. I built it for a life, not just for myself." He stopped. "I built it hoping you'd want to share it if you'd agree to marry me." She had known the question was coming. Knowing it was coming did not diminish the weight of it when it arrived, did not diminish the way her chest contracted with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy but contained the best of both, which is what the serious things in life generally feel like. "Yes," she said, "I'd very much like to marry you, Simon Ellsworth." He exhaled, and she understood from the sound of it that he had been more uncertain than he had let on, which she found so endearing it tipped the feeling she was carrying closer to joy. He reached into his coat pocket with his left hand and produced a ring, a simple band with a small turquoise stone, the color of the Texas sky in winter. He told her he had ordered it from a jeweler in San Antonio, and that he had chosen the turquoise because of where they were, because it was a stone of this land, because he wanted her to have something that was of this place they were both choosing to make their home. She held out her left hand and he put it on, and it fit, and they stood on the road in front of the house he had built, and she looked at the ring and then at him and then at the house again, and it all seemed to her to be the same thing, the same decision, the same insistence, the same turning of intention into something real and solid that could not be taken back. They were married in September, at the white church that the Reverend had finally gotten around to painting. The whole town came, as the whole town always came to weddings in Calico Creek, because a wedding is the kind of event that transcends most social objections. Gerald Mercer was there, and he shook Simon's hand at the door and said, with more sincerity than Louise had previously credited him with, "I was wrong about you, son. I'm glad to know it." Simon shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." Clara Mercer caught Louise near the church door and took her hands and said, "You chose well." And Louise looked at her and saw a woman who had watched her husband's smallness from a closer distance than anyone else for a long time, and who was genuinely glad that something had interrupted the pattern, and she squeezed Clara's hands and said, "I know." The ceremony was simple and direct, performed by a reverend who had a good voice, and understood that a wedding is not about the ceremony, but about what the ceremony is marking. When he asked Simon to take Louise for his wife, Simon looked at her and said, "I do," with such complete certainty that a woman in the third pew started crying, not from sorrow but from the recognition of something that was entirely real. When he asked Louise to take Simon, she looked straight at him and said, "I do, with my whole heart." And the Reverend blinked slightly at the addition but said nothing, because it seemed exactly appropriate. They walked out of the church into the September afternoon as husband and wife, into the thin Texas sunshine and the sound of people cheering, and Louise Dugan became Louise Ellsworth with the feeling that it was not an erasure of herself but an expansion. She was not less Louise Dugan for being Louise Ellsworth. She was more, because she was choosing to be. They drove up the creek road in Jeb Haverson's good wagon which he had lent for the occasion, and when the house came into view, Simon pulled the horse to a stop and let her look at it. "Welcome home," he said. She laughed because the phrase was so simple and so enormous at the same time. "Welcome home," she said back to him. That autumn, they settled into the house the way people settle into things they have built with their own hands, with a combination of satisfaction and the practical ongoing work of making it fully livable. Louise set up a proper teaching corner in the main room, with her McGuffey readers and her Missouri books arranged on shelves Simon built along one wall. She continued teaching at the schoolhouse through the week, and on weekends she worked in the kitchen and the small kitchen garden Simon had prepared a patch of ground for. Simon continued at the Haverson Ranch through the fall, but Haverson had also started talking to him about something else. There were several ranchers in the area who needed structures built, barns mostly, some storage buildings, a bunkhouse or two, and word had gotten around since the house went up that if you wanted work done right and done with remarkable speed, Simon Ellsworth was the man to see about it. The reputation had traveled faster than either of them expected, carried along the same roads and the same conversations that had previously carried the Pitied. He spent October building a barn for the Strand family, the Norwegian newcomers, at a rate that astonished Olav Strand, who had done his own carpentry in Norway and knew the work. Olav brought Simon coffee in the mornings and watched him with the frank admiration of one craftsman observing another, and at the end of the week he shook Simon's hand and paid him more than they had agreed on and said, in his careful English, that it was the best barn in the county. Louise heard this report with a satisfaction that was not exactly pride, but was adjacent to it, the particular feeling of watching someone you love be recognized for the thing they actually are. That winter was mild by Texas standards, though the nights were cold enough to make the kitchen hearth the center of the house in the evenings. They read by the fire, which was a thing they both valued for reasons that had been separately formed, and now joined into the shared pleasure of two people who liked the same activities and liked them more for having company in them. She read to him sometimes, or he to her, alternating chapters of whatever book they were working through, and the argument about books continued in its pleasant form, which was really a form of conversation that had no beginning and no end. She was pregnant by January, which she knew before she told him, carrying the knowledge for a week with a kind of wondering solemnity, turning it over and examining it, feeling it change the texture of the future in her mind. She told him on a Sunday evening sitting by the fire, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, then something very still and concentrated, then the wide-open smile that she had never stopped being grateful for, given how carefully it was usually kept. He reached across and took her hand. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing because it was the important thing. "Very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings." "Tell me what you need," he said. "I'll tell you when I know," she said, and he accepted this completely, which was one of the things she loved about him. He could follow her lead without making a performance of the following. She was well through the winter and the early spring. She taught until April, when the discomfort of the pregnancy made standing for long hours difficult, and then she handed the school over temporarily to the Reverend's wife, who was a capable woman and had been half-trained as a teacher before her marriage. The town accepted this transition without the difficulty Louise had half expected, partly because she had spent 6 months establishing herself so thoroughly as the school's teacher that her temporary absence was understood to be temporary. Simon built an addition to the back of the house in March, a small room off the kitchen that would serve as the nursery. He did it in 4 days, working in the evenings after his ranch work, and Louise sat in the kitchen and watched him through the window sometimes, working by lantern light after dark, and she thought she had never seen anything so quietly determined in her life. Their son was born in May of 1879, on a warm spring morning that smelled of the creek and the live oaks coming into their summer leaves. He came into the world with a considerable amount of opinion expressed at volume, which Simon said was a sign of good character, and Louise said was probably inherited from his side of the family, and Simon acknowledged this was possible. They named him James Henry Ellsworth James for Simon's father, who had been a good man according to Simon's careful account, and Henry for Louise's father, whose name she wanted to carry forward into the next generation. James was loud and healthy and had Louise's dark red hair and Simon's steady gray eyes, and he slept in the nursery room in the little crib Simon had built, and he was the object of more focused attention from 2 people than any infant in Calico Creek had received in recent memory. When she brought James into town for the first time, wrapped in the good wool blanket Clara Mercer had made as a wedding gift, the women of Calico Creek descended on him with the warmth that small-town women extend to babies regardless of any other opinion they might have held. Mrs. Webb declared him a very fine boy. Clara Mercer said he had the look of his father about him in the best possible way. Even Gerald Mercer looked at the baby and then at Simon and said, "Fine-looking boy, Ellsworth," with the complete sincerity of a man who has decided, once and fully, to adjust his views. Summer came, and James grew with the efficient pace of a baby who has decided that being in the world is an interesting project, and he intends to get on with it. Louise resumed teaching in the fall, bringing James to the schoolhouse on certain days when Simon was working further from home, and her students, who ranged from 6 to 14, treated the baby with a gravity that she found both comic and touching. Even the oldest boys, who generally considered sentimentality beneath them, took turns holding James during the midday break with expressions of concentrated responsibility. Simon's building reputation had grown through the year into something like a proper trade. He had built 3 barns, a bunkhouse, a storage structure for the mill, and a chicken house that Mrs. Haverson had requested specifically because she had heard his work was square and his prices were fair. He was making more from the building work than from the ranch labor, and Jeb Haverson, with the pragmatism of a man who recognizes when an arrangement has run its natural course, said that he understood if Simon needed to move on to the new work full-time and that his door was always open. Simon thanked him and moved on. The building work was good, but what Simon had been thinking about through the year was the land itself, the 40 acres that were his, that were more than a house site. He had been studying the soil and the water, watching how the creek behaved through wet seasons and dry, thinking about what could grow there. He had talked to the Strand family about their farming, since they had worked similar soil in very different conditions, and had a working knowledge of what adapted and what did not. He had talked to an old Mexican rancher named Cipriano who worked land to the south, and who knew this country's rhythms in his bones, and was willing to teach them to anyone who was serious enough to learn. In the fall of 1879, Simon planted his first real crop, sorghum and wheat, divided across 30 of the 40 acres, with the remaining 10 kept for pasture, and the kitchen garden Louise had expanded into something more ambitious. He planted it carefully, working the ground with a mold-board plow that he had adapted, as he adapted everything for one-handed operation, with a guide handle reconfigured, and a knee brace that let him control the plow's direction without a second hand. Cipriano came and watched him work one afternoon in October, standing at the field's edge with his arms folded, And after a while he said, in the measured mixture of Spanish and English that they had developed between them, that Simon's furrows were very straight. Simon said thank you. Cipriano said that most men needed 2 hands to run a straight furrow. Simon said that most men had not spent 3 years thinking about how to do it with one. Cipriano laughed at this, the full genuine laugh of a man who finds something both funny and admirable, and from that day forward they were something more than acquaintances, which mattered to Simon more than he showed, because Cipriano knew this land and this country at a level of depth that Simon was still reaching for, and that knowledge was freely shared between them. Louise watched all of this, the building, the farming, the quiet accumulation of respect, and she wrote about it in the journal she had kept since coming west. She wrote about Simon with the honesty that comes from writing for yourself rather than for an audience, which meant she wrote not just about what she admired, but about what scared her, which was the size of the feeling, the way it had become so much of the context of her life that she could not imagine the context without it. She wrote that she thought this was probably what love was, not the beginning of it, which was easy and exciting, but the settled middle of it, which was where the real weight was, and where you found out whether you had made a real thing or a pleasant one. She had made a real thing. She knew that more clearly every day. They had arguments, as real things require, about money in the lean months, about how hard he worked when she wanted him to rest, about her tendency to take on more responsibility at the school than was technically hers, about the particular stubbornness that lived in both of them and that, while it had served each of them well individually, required significant negotiation when it encountered its mirror in another person. These were not comfortable arguments, but they were honest ones, and they ended with the conversation going somewhere that improved things, which meant they were useful rather than merely painful. One argument in the winter of 1879 was larger than the others. It was about the town, specifically about an incident in which one of Louise's older students, a boy named Thomas, had told James in the hearing of other children that James's father was a cripple, and that cripples could not farm and could not build and could not really do anything properly, and that the town only put up with him because his wife was the schoolteacher. Thomas had been repeating something he had heard at home, which was the most clarifying detail of the incident. Louise had handled Thomas in school, firmly and without cruelty, in the way she handled all incidents of that kind, by examining the statement, identifying what was wrong with it and why, and expecting better. She had written a letter to Thomas's parents. She had told Simon about it that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with James asleep in the next room, and she had been calm while she told it because she had managed the situation and it was done. Simon had been quiet through the telling. He was quiet for a moment after. "He's 4 years old," he said. "He'll hear things. I always heard things." "I know," she said. "That's why I am telling you." "What do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing," she said. "I've done what needs doing. I'm telling you because you should know what your son is going to encounter sometimes, and because I want us to decide together how we'll help him through it. Not now he's 4, but eventually." He looked at her across the table. "You're worried he'll be hurt by it." "Yes," she said. "Aren't you?" "Yes," he said. "But I think about what he sees every day too. He sees his father do things. He doesn't understand yet what other people think those things should require. He just knows that his father does them." He paused. "That will matter more than what Thomas says." She thought about this for a long moment. Then she said, "You're right, that will matter more." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. "But it doesn't mean it won't hurt sometimes." "No," he said, "it doesn't mean that." They sat there at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the sleeping baby in the next room and the Texas winter quiet around the house. And they were simply 2 people who were trying to build something good in the middle of a world that was not always cooperating, and who were doing it together, which made it better than either of them could have managed alone. The years turned with the particular rhythm of working land, the planting and growing and harvesting, and the resting and beginning again that marks time in a way that is both relentless and deeply satisfying when the work is your own. By 1882, Simon had 40 acres fully productive, with the sorghum and wheat established and paying, and a small peach orchard planted along the north edge of the property that Cipriano had advised, and that would take 5 years to produce. But that was already a source of particular satisfaction, because a peach tree is an act of faith in the future. Louise was expecting their second child in the spring of 1882, which she had known since Christmas, and which she told Simon on New Year's morning while James, now nearly 3 and in vigorous command of his physical environment, was attempting to climb the porch railing. Simon looked at James and then at Louise and said, "He's going to teach that baby everything he knows." "That is exactly what worries me," Louise said, and Simon laughed and pulled her against him with his one arm, which was as complete an embrace as any two-armed man had ever given, and she felt it in every part of herself. Their second child, a girl they named Ruth Ann Ellsworth, arrived in April of 1882 with less urgency than James, but no less conviction about her own importance. She was fair-haired, which surprised them both, since both her parents were dark, but she had Simon's steady eyes and Louise's straight manner of looking at things, and she fit into the family with the ease of something that has been expected and is nonetheless a gift when it arrives. James received his sister with the serious regard of a 3-year-old who has been told he is going to have a sibling and has spent several months incorporating this information. He looked at Ruth for a long time when Louise first showed her to him, and then he said with great deliberateness, "She is very small." Louise said yes. James said he would protect her. Louise said that was very kind. James said he needed to tell father. He went and found Simon in the kitchen and told him in the same serious tone that James was going to protect Ruth, and Simon, with equal gravity, said that was an excellent plan and that he could count on Simon's assistance in this. This promise was kept in its various forms for the rest of their lives. The house continued to be added to as the family grew. Simon built a sleeping room for James at the back of the upper half-story, and added a wide dormer window that caught the south light and that James, when he was older, would claim as his reading place, having inherited his parents' habit in this as in many things. Calico Creek grew too in those years. New families came, some from the east, some from Mexico, some from further south within Texas. The injustices of the era were not absent from Calico Creek, and Louise was aware of them in ways that her position as schoolteacher made impossible to ignore. There were families who could not access the same resources as others because of where they had come from or what they looked like, and there were hierarchies in the town that replicated the worst impulses of the society that had produced them. She taught all the children who came to her school with the same expectation and the same rigor, regardless of whose children they were, and she was quiet but firm when the school board, which was Gerald Mercer, and 2 other men with too much opinion, tried to tell her that some children needed less instruction than others. She won that argument by the simple method of continuing to do what she had always done and pointing to the results, which were that her students could read and write and do arithmetic at a level that consistently impressed visitors from the county seat, and that this outcome was not diminished by having been achieved by all of them together. Simon had a similar understanding with the ranching and farming community. He hired men from whatever background they came from, paid equal wages for equal work, and did not tolerate conversations in his hearing that assumed otherwise. He said very little about this as a principle, because he found that principles announced too loudly tended to be examined more than practiced, and he preferred to simply practice. Cipriano introduced Simon to several Mexican farming families who were trying to establish claims on the land to the south, and Simon helped 3 of those families build structures over the course of 1882 and 1883, charging them the same fair rate he charged the wealthier ranchers and doing work of the same quality. This was not universally popular in Calico Creek, but Simon had reached a position of sufficient regard in the community built, literally, from the ground up, that the most significant opposition was limited to the same circles that had originally pitied him, whose opinion he had always considered self-canceling. In 1883, Gerald Mercer asked Simon to build a new storefront for the Mercer feed mill. He came to Simon's property on a weekday afternoon, hat in hand, and he was honest about it in a way that suggested the hat in hand was not just formality. "You're the best builder between here and San Antonio," Gerald said. "I should have said so a long time ago, but I'm saying it now." Simon quoted him a fair price. Gerald said agreed without haggling, which was unusual for Gerald and which was itself a form of apology. Simon built the storefront in 2 weeks, and when it was done, Gerald looked at it and said, "Every man in this town is going to know who built this." "I don't need them to know," Simon said. "No," Gerald said, "but they should." The Mercer storefront became, in its quiet way, a kind of monument not to Simon specifically, but to the revision of a collective idea. It stood on the main street of Calico Creek for decades, solid and well-proportioned, built by a man that the town had once assigned to the category of pitiable, and every time someone looked at it and knew who had built it, something in the accounting had to be corrected. Louise had a conversation with Clara Mercer not long after the storefront was finished, sitting on Clara's porch in the autumn shade. Clara said, "I think Gerald learned something these past years." "About what pity really is." Louise said, "What did he learn?" Clara said, "That it's mostly about the person feeling it, that it doesn't have much to do with the person it's aimed at." Louise thought about this for a moment. "That's true," she said, "though I think most people who have been on the receiving end of it could have told him that at the start." Clara said, "Yes, but I suppose we don't always ask the people who know." "No," Louise said, "we don't." James started at the school in the fall of 1883, when he was 4 years old, which was young but which Louise justified on the ground that she knew the teacher personally and could monitor his progress. He sat in the front row and watched her with the intense concentration of a child who finds it strange and fascinating to see his mother be a different kind of person in this room, and who is also paying close attention to everything she says, because it is clear that this is important. He learned quickly, as she had expected, and with the slight impatience of a child who has been talked to as an intelligent person since before he could properly talk back. She managed this in the classroom by giving him more difficult work, which absorbed his restlessness, and at home by the ongoing practice of conversations at the kitchen table about whatever they were reading or thinking about, which had always been the climate of the house. Simon watched his son in school once, through the window, without James seeing him. He watched Louise teach, the way she moved through the room, the way she managed the complicated social ecosystem of children of different ages in the same space, the way she found the thing that made each child lean forward rather than back. He stood at the window for 10 minutes and felt something so full it barely had a name. It was something like astonishment at the scale of what she did and the competence with which she did it, and something like gratitude that this was the person James was learning from, and something else underneath both of those that was just the oldest and most straightforward thing, which was that he loved her. He went home and made dinner, which he had learned to do well over the years of their marriage, adapting techniques as he adapted everything else, so that one-handed cooking was simply cooking. When she came in with James that afternoon and the room smelled like cornbread and venison stew, she stopped in the doorway and said, "You made supper," with the tone of someone who is pleased and is not trying to hide it. "I did," he said. "What did we do to deserve this?" "Nothing particular," he said. "I just felt like it." She looked at him for a moment across the kitchen. "You saw something today that made you happy," she said, because she knew him fully and specifically the way you know a person after years of living close to their mind. He smiled. "I watched you teach." She looked at him steadily. And you're extraordinary," he said, "in case you had any doubt about it." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, and James, who had followed her in and whose tolerance for adult sentiment was still developing, said, "Can we eat now?" which broke the moment into laughter, and everything continued from there. The years kept turning. Ruth grew from a careful, observant baby into a careful, observant small girl who had strong opinions about the natural world and carried beetles and grasshoppers and interesting rocks into the house with the confidence of a person who considers these things self-evidently valuable. Simon built her a shelf for the rocks and did not say anything about the beetles except to ask her to release them before she went to sleep, which she agreed to with the seriousness of a negotiated settlement. Louise had one more pregnancy in 1885, which did not go as the others had. She lost the baby in the 4th month, quietly and with the particular grief that has no very good language around it because the child was real to the parents and unreal to everyone else, and so the loss sat in an uncomfortable in-between. Simon was with her through all of it, in the complete way that he was with her through all things, not trying to fix it or minimize it, but simply being present with the full weight of it, which was what she needed and what he understood how to give. They did not speak of it much afterward, but they did speak of it, and that made it a grief they carried together rather than separately, which is a significant difference. In 1886, Louise gave birth to their 3rd child, a boy they named Henry, taking the name from Louise's father that she had originally given to James's middle name and now gave in full to this new boy, feeling that the name was large enough for both and that her father would have appreciated the doubling. Henry arrived in the world with the complete physical confidence of a child who has decided that everything is going to be fine, and he maintained this attitude with remarkable consistency through his early childhood, which gave his parents a great deal to enjoy and occasionally to manage. By the time Henry arrived, the Ellsworth property was one of the most productive small farms in the county. The peach orchard had been producing for 2 years, and the peaches were remarkable, deep-fleshed and sweet, the kind of peach that people travel for. Louise put them up in jars every summer, filling the cellar with the color of them, and sold the surplus at the Calico Creek market, which had grown into a proper monthly institution. The wheat and sorghum were consistent. The kitchen garden had expanded twice, and she had added tomatoes and peppers, and a row of herbs that made the kitchen smell like something out of a story. Simon's building reputation had by this time extended well beyond Calico Creek, reaching into the surrounding counties and occasionally beyond. He took on the work he chose and passed on the work that did not interest him, which was a luxury he had not always had and which he did not take lightly. He had trained 2 young men from the county to assist him on larger projects. They worked with him for seasons at a time, learned his methods, and went on to their own work carrying techniques that existed because one man had spent years rethinking what was possible. He took quiet satisfaction in this, in the way that he took satisfaction in all the things he had built, not loudly, not performatively, but with the deep and private pleasure of a person who has done what they set out to do. Calico Creek in 1886 was not the same town it had been in 1878. The population had grown. There was a proper hotel now and a second general store. The school had expanded, and Louise had a part-time assistant who took the younger children while she worked with the older ones. The church had been painted white twice over. Gerald Mercer had retired from the feed mill and passed it to his son-in-law, and Gerald himself had become something of a town historian, going around and telling stories of the old days that were more honest than the originals had been. One of the stories Gerald told, at the saloon and at the church socials and anywhere else people would listen, was about the spring of 1878 when a one-armed cowboy had ridden into Calico Creek and the town had pitied him, and what the town had then watched him build. Gerald told this story with what Louise, when she heard it, thought was a reasonable amount of self-awareness about his own role in the early part of it. He did not make himself a villain, but he did not spare himself either, and she respected that. Simon heard his own story told at a church social one autumn evening in 1886, standing near the back of the gathering with Henry in his arm, because Henry, at 6 months, was still at the age of preferring to be carried, while Gerald Mercer held forth near the front. He listened to it with the expression of a man who finds it mildly peculiar to hear his own life described from the outside, but who cannot find anything factually incorrect in the account. Louise appeared at his elbow. "How does it feel to be a legend?" she asked quietly. "Peculiar," he said. "You are, you know," she said. "Whether you like it or not." "I built a house," he said. "You built a house in 11 weeks with one arm," she said. "And then you built 12 more buildings and a farm and raised 2.5 children. 2.5. Henry is only 6 months old. He barely counts yet." He looked at her in the way that had not changed since the first time he had looked at her, with this particular quality, with the fullness of what he felt available in it, not performed, not managed. "I built the first house because I wanted to prove something," he said quietly. "I've built everything since because I wanted to. There's a difference." "I know," she said. "That's the better story." Gerald Mercer had, by this point, reached the part of the story where the house was done, and Carter Webb had reported it to the saloon, and several people were listening with the expressions of people hearing something they already knew but are still glad to hear told well. He was getting to the marriage, which he described as inevitable, and which made Louise smile from across the room. She looked at Simon and then at Henry, who was regarding the gathering with the large-eyed seriousness of a baby who is taking in information rapidly. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like James," Simon said. "James looked like you." "Ruth looks like nobody in the family," Louise said. "She looks like her own person." "That's apt," he said, and they both acknowledged this with the shared amusement of two parents who know their children in full. The years after that were, in the sense that matters most, good years, not perfect, because no years are but full. James grew into a young man who read everything he could find, and who had strong opinions about land law that he had developed partly from conversations at the kitchen table, and partly from his own observations of who in the county had access to what and why. He was 17 in 1896, tall and dark-haired and possessed of his mother's directness, and his father's patience in a combination that made him, people said, interesting to talk to and very difficult to argue with unnecessarily. Ruth, 2 years younger, was at 15 already the most accomplished naturalist the Calico Creek school had produced, which she had achieved largely by learning everything Louise taught and then going considerably further on her own. She corresponded with a biologist at the State University who had heard of her collections and observations through channels that no one quite traced, and she had ambitions that were larger than Calico Creek and that her parents understood and intended to support. Henry, the youngest, was 10 in 1896 and was primarily interested in horses, and in the question of where exactly the creek went if you followed it far enough, which he had so far investigated to a distance of 4 miles, before being retrieved by Simon on 2 separate occasions. He was a confident and cheerful child who had inherited his parents' self-possession, without their tendency towards seriousness, which meant he was the one who laughed the most at dinner, and who could talk his way out of most situations with a combination of charm and genuine goodwill that both his parents found, in private, completely irresistible. The house was full of them, full of their noise and their opinions and their various projects, and Louise would sometimes stand in the main room in the early mornings before any of them were up and look at it. The books on the shelves Simon had built, the peach preserves on the kitchen shelf, the drawings Ruth had tacked to the wall beside the south window, James's boots by the door, Henry's collection of river stones in a bucket near the porch, and feel the weight of it. The warm, specific gravity of a life that had been built rather than happened into. She thought sometimes about the woman who had crossed the main street of Calico Creek in the spring of 1878 with a stack of McGuffey readers, watching a one-armed cowboy walk into the general store with a confidence that the town could not account for. She thought about what that woman had known and what she had not known. She thought that the not knowing had been important, that if she had known all of it from the start, the knowing would have been different from the living, and the living was the better thing. On a Sunday morning in the fall of 1896, Simon and Louise sat on the porch of the house he had built, the original house, still standing solid after 18 years, with additions and improvements but with its bones unchanged because the bones had been right from the start. The peach orchard was visible from the porch in the middle distance, the trees heavy and golden at this time of year. The creek was low, the way it always was in the autumn, but still running, the water clear over the stones. James had gone to check the fencing on the south pasture, which was his responsibility now, and which he discharged with the same methodical attention his father gave everything. Ruth was in her room writing to the biologist in Austin. Henry was somewhere along the creek, which was his natural habitat and which they had long since stopped worrying about excessively. Simon's left hand was on the armrest of his chair. Louise's hand was on top of it. This was not dramatic. It was simply the natural position, the default, the way things settled when there was no reason for them to be any different. "Do you remember," she said, "when Gerald Mercer asked you if you needed help and you said you'd let him know?" "I don't remember him asking," Simon said. "He was going to," she said. "He had the look of a man assembling a charitable offer." "You walked away before he got to it." "Did I?" He considered this. "Good instinct, apparently." "Very good instinct," she agreed. They looked at the orchard for a while. The light was the particular autumn light of that part of Texas, low and golden and long, the kind of light that makes everything look like a painting of itself. "Simon," she said. "Yes. I want you to know I have wanted to tell you this for a long time, but I keep finding it difficult to say without it sounding less than it is." She paused, turning slightly to look at him. His profile against the October light was still the thing she had first seen on the main street, the jaw, the steadiness, the hat tilted against the sun. "I think you are the bravest person I know. Not because of the arm, not because of the house. Because of all of it, all the years of it, the way you decided what you were going to be and then became it without waiting for anyone's permission. And because you chose me to be part of it, and I have never, for one day, stopped being glad that you did." He was quiet for a moment. He turned to look at her, and she saw again what she had been seeing for 18 years, the thing he did not give out easily, now given fully. "Louise," he said. "Yes. I built the first house because I had to prove something," he said, repeating what he had told her at the church social a decade ago. "But the proof turned out to be the least important part of it. The important part was that you came and sat under that oak tree." He looked at her steadily. "Everything after that was a house worth building." She tightened her hand on his. The orchard was gold and still. The creek ran. Inside the house behind them, somewhere in the upper story, Ruth's door opened and closed, and the sound of her footsteps moved through the house in the comfortable rhythm of someone moving through a place they belong. James came back from the south pasture in the late afternoon and sat on the porch steps and reported that the fencing was sound and that he had seen a group of pronghorn near the creek bend, which he said in the tone of someone noting a favorable development. Henry came back from the creek at supper time with wet boots, and the news that the creek went on further than he had previously determined, which was his consistent finding and which everyone agreed was interesting. Ruth made biscuits because she had decided to, which she did with her mother's efficiency and no particular announcement, and they all sat down at the kitchen table together in the lamplight, Simon at one end, Louise at the other, James on one side, Ruth and Henry on the other, and they ate together the way families eat when they have been eating together long enough that the particular pleasure of it has become too familiar to notice except in moments like this one, when it catches you and you see it clearly. Louise looked at all of them around the table, at James, who had his father's hands, well, his father's way with his hands, the same deliberateness, the same economy of motion. At Ruth, who was explaining something about insect classification to Henry, who was listening with more interest than he usually devoted to anything that did not involve horses or water. At Simon, who was eating and listening, and sometimes saying something quiet that made James nod, the conversation between them easy and equal in the way that a father and almost grown son can sometimes achieve. She did not say anything about what she was feeling. She did not need to. She simply sat at the end of the table in the house built on her husband's land and listened to her family be alive. And she thought that this specific and irreplaceable thing, was what it all came down to. The house stood for many decades after that. James eventually took over the farm and expanded the orchard, and he did it with the same careful attention his father had brought to everything, understanding that a peach tree is a long conversation with the future, and that you have to be willing to begin it before you can receive the answer. Ruth went to the university in Austin and studied biology, and came back changed in ways that Calico Creek did not always know what to do with. But she had her mother's quality of simply continuing to do what she had decided was right regardless, and so she found her path. Henry became a cattleman and worked the land to the south of the family property, and he was good at it, good with animals and good with people, which turned out to be nearly the same skill. He married a young woman from a farming family near Fredericksburg in 1906, when he was 20 years old, and brought her home to meet his parents with the combination of pride and slight nervousness that the occasion called for. Simon and Louise received her on the porch of the house, the same porch where they had sat that autumn morning, where the chairs still stood side by side in their long-established positions. They were in their early 50s by then, both of them gray at the edges and neither of them diminished by it, both of them still themselves in the ways that had always mattered. Simon built Henry and his wife a house on the south property. He built it in 6 weeks, which was slower than 11 because he was older, and he had decided that he did not need to prove anything to anyone anymore. But it was better than the first one because he had been building things for 28 years, and everything he had learned was in it. Louise taught at the Calico Creek School until 1904, when the town had grown enough to need 2 full-time teachers, and she trained her replacement herself over a full year, passing on the methods and the expectations and the conviction that every child in the room deserved the same attention, the same rigor, the same faith in their capacity. When she stopped teaching, she did not stop. She began writing. The journal she had always kept became something longer and more deliberate, an account of the years, of Calico Creek and the land, and the particular kind of life that had been possible here. She wrote it honestly, which meant she wrote about the injustices alongside the beauties, about the pity and the hardness alongside the community and the care. She showed it to Simon one evening in 1905, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight as they had always sat. She pushed the manuscript across to him, and he read it, slowly and in silence, his hand moving to the next page with the patience he brought to everything. When he was finished, he looked up at her. "This is good," he said. "Is it accurate?" she asked. He thought about this. "The house took 12 weeks, not 11, he said. She looked at him. "Carter Webb said 11. "Carter Webb was not measuring the finishing work," he said. "I put the last board down at week 12. She took the manuscript back and made the correction. "Anything else?" he considered. "The part about the first Sunday I called on you," he said. "You said you weren't nervous." She paused. "I was not nervous," she said. "You folded that handkerchief 4 times, he said. "I counted." She looked at him for a long moment, and then the smile came, the one she had given him the first time at the church social, with the slight edge to it. "I was being precise," she said. He smiled back, and it was the same smile, the one that cost him and that she had always been grateful for. "Yes," he said. "You were." They sat at the kitchen table in the house he had built for them, in the lamplight that had lit so many evenings of talking and arguing and reading, and just being quietly in the same room, and the night outside was very still, and the peach orchard was dark against the sky, and the creek was running somewhere in the distance, and everything that had been built. The house and the farm and the family and the long, patient architecture of their life together was around them, complete. Not perfect, complete. And that, Louise thought, as she put her pen to the page and wrote the next word, was more than enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything.